Hi, everybody. Thanks again so much for coming out. As you heard, I had the great honor of being on the Gale Borden board until I moved away a couple years ago. So it's really an honor to be back. It's the greatest library in the world, and I'm really just honored to be here. A little nostalgic, a little emotional. So we're here to learn about Southern Illinois. But before we do that, you can learn a little bit about me. I'm your ranger tonight. I'm a self-certified Illinois expert. If there was a formal certification, I would pursue it. But unfortunately, you just have to take my word for it. But as you heard, I spent my whole life kind of camping with my grandparents and my dad. I went to school in Champaign, and when my wife and I were dating, she worked at a museum. And she worked weekends, and I worked more of a 9-to-5 schedule, so we had very little overlapping time off. So we became very skilled at those kind of day trips, overnight trips, really, really local travel, because we just didn't have a lot of time off together. So that's how I came to my immense knowledge. But I do like to also kind of issue a disclaimer, in case there's any FBI agents in the room. I am not a U.S. Forest Ranger. I am just a metaphorical ranger. I don't want to go to jail for impersonating a federal officer. So let's see here. So before we get any further, we need to agree on a common shared definition of Southern Illinois. There's a lot of ways to define the region and break up the state. Many of you have probably heard the old joke that anything south of I-80 is Southern Illinois. We would be here all night if we went with that definition. So we'll narrow it down a little further. A really common kind of governmental definition uses I-70. It's a line between Indianapolis and St. Louis, basically. And that's a very useful way to look at the state. But again, because I only have about an hour, we'll narrow things down a little bit more, mainly to this area here. The kind of tourism lingo for it is southernmost Illinois. I have great love for this area too. If there's any big fans of Marion County or something like that, we can talk afterwards. Okay, we have one, I guess. That's great. But we'll really be focusing on the Shawnee National Forest and the area around there, just because that's where a lot of the prospective tourists want to go. So why? Why do they want to go there? It's got opportunities to hike, climb, horseback ride, hunt, fish, zip line. There aren't a lot of natural places to zip line in the state of Illinois. So the point being, it's got a really, really unique geography for the state and for the Midwest, really. It's in all my travels, I find it's about the closest destination to us here in Elgin, where you can really feel like you've gotten away from it all. There's plenty of places that are pretty elsewhere in the state. Probably a lot of you have been to Galena. It's a little closer, but I feel like I haven't quite escaped the pull of civilization until I've gotten down to Southern Illinois. It can be really remote. You can lose your cell phone signal, and it's one of the few places you can actually get lost these days. So, and there's some gravel roads and creeks that you have to drive across. So it really is kind of a rugged, special place. So before we get into, sorry, I went a little crazy with the animations. This was the first, I give a few different topics, and this is the first one I made, and I had got too much of a thrill from the dramatic slide transitions. So before we get into the kind of travel tips, we will just begin with a little geography and history lesson. And again, because time is limited, I'm sure you all have lives. As far as Illinois is concerned, I don't. This is what I love to talk about. But since we're limited on time, we'll only go back about 65 billion years to the Cretaceous period. There's lots of great stuff that happened before then. We just can't talk about it tonight. The middle of the continent was covered by this inland sea. And so this is where our story begins. You'll see there's this kind of like proto-Gulf of Mexico. Now that's controversial to say. I have to just come up with a new line for that. We'll just say the sea kind of encroaches into the southern tip of Illinois, as you can tell there. And that's when the magic starts. That's when this part of the state starts to be a little bit different than the rest of the state. And even though you're kind of high up in the bluffs, a lot of the time when you're in the Shawnee Forest, you're actually standing on the bottom of this ancient sea. And there's a lot of like fossil remnants that you can still see there. There's a lot of interesting striations in the rocks, and that's all formed by thousands and thousands of years of being underwater. Now we'll flash forward to modern times. Up until about 11,000 years ago, most of the state was covered by ice during the Ice Age, by glaciers. That's when this Wisconsin glacier was the most recent glacier. It came in about 75,000 years ago, left about 11,000 years ago. And when these glaciers come in, they kind of, I'm using the technical geological term here, smoosh all the hills and fill in the valleys, and they leave this kind of flat, muddy mess that if you're familiar with travel elsewhere in the state, that's what we associate with the Illinois landscape. If you have been to Galena, you'll notice Galena and the Shawnee National Forest area share this common trait, which is through some quirk of geology, which I am not intelligent enough to explain, the glaciers just never got there. And so what you're looking at when you're in the Shawnee National Forest is a truly ancient, prehistoric landscape. And it makes you wonder, if it wasn't for these darn glaciers, what the rest of the state would look like. But a little bit more recent now, we're talking about the year 900 to 1300. Southern Illinois, a little bit north of the Shawnee Forest, was kind of the cultural capital for this huge civilization that we now call Mississippian culture. Europeans never interacted with Mississippians, and that's when all the written history starts. So we don't know what these people would have called themselves. You've probably also heard the term Cahokia Mounds, just outside of St. Louis in Illinois. That was the center of their civilization. But their culture kind of spread along the Mississippi River and up the many rivers that feed into it. And there's some evidence of them in the Shawnee National Forest, but really just around southern Illinois in general, and really the entire interior of the continent. The kind of colloquial term that we're moving away from is mound builders. You may have heard that term as well. So we don't really know much about the first kind of earliest civilization that we have evidence of because Europeans never interacted with them. By the time the French showed up, that culture was long gone. And because of kind of, Marquette and Joliet were the first Europeans, the first people to come in and actually record what was going on in the region. They came down the Mississippi River and they passed right through southern Illinois, and they mapped it out, and we got some interesting trivia about the area. But when Marquette and Joliet were here, this was in 1673 or so, they weren't like encountering this untouched, primitive, primal landscape. The Spanish had been in America for over 100 years prior, and a lot of the things that they introduced, disease, kind of population displacement, had already reached southern Illinois, even though the Spanish themselves never were there. So although Marquette and Joliet kind of thought that they were seeing this state of nature or something, they were really seeing the end result of 100 plus years of Spanish meddling. And because of that, this area was called the vacant quarter of the known continent at the time. It was kind of like empty of native inhabitants. Some Native Americans, like the Shawnee, were kind of moving in from being displaced, but it was a region in a state of flux, and it kind of lends to this aura of mystery that we have, first with the Mississippians, then with the kind of like transitionary state that the French discovered the area to be in. We just don't know quite what was happening in the area the way we do for other parts of the Midwest. Here's another map. This map's from 1717, and I like to point out this ancient fort. You can go see this at Giant City State Park. It's kind of just a pile of rocks, but it's still interesting. And scientists think it's from about the year 600. So that's how old this is. Nobody knows who built that fort. We can only speculate as to why. But this is something that I really love about the Shawnee Forest area is the sense of deep history that we'll never quite understand. There's a lot of legend and lore and rumor and theory, and it makes it a really, really unique, interesting place. So does anyone know what year Illinois became a state? Uh-oh, this is a well-educated crowd. I like when nobody knows, because then I know you'll just trust whatever I say. Yes, it's 1818. This is a map from the time of statehood, and you'll notice the area we kind of know as the most densely populated part of the state is virtually empty on this map. And down here in southern Illinois, we've done a lot of surveying and understanding, and Americans have come and settled the area already by the time of statehood. We can ignore this up here. Western Illinois was actually set aside for veterans of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So they had actually surveyed this land and kind of platted it out, but it didn't have a lot of settlers coming in there yet. All the activity was in southern Illinois. So as far as Illinois state history goes, it all starts down here. The reason for that is because if you were coming from the former colonies, the East Coast, the easiest way to head west was through the Cumberland Gap to get across the mountains. You'd sail up the Cumberland River, you'd reach the Ohio River, which is our southern border, and now all of a sudden you have this chance to have a new life. So all the early settlement in the state was in southern Illinois. Our first two capitals were in southern Illinois before it got moved up to Springfield, thanks to a fellow named Abe Lincoln. So, one story I do like to tell about the statehood era that is kind of amusing. There's a lot of anecdotes about, so Indiana had just become a state, and there's a lot of advantages to statehood. You get representation in Congress, you get some more federal funding, just like today. And so okay, I keep kind of stepping in it here until recently. So we early Illinoisans, I keep saying we, I wasn't there, but early Illinois settlers got together and said, we need to become a state. So they sent a little delegation over to Washington, D.C., and we did our best. I noticed you just made Indiana a state. Do you think perhaps we could do that too? But we kind of fell short of the stipulations in the law for establishing new states at that time. So Congress said, we kind of went back and forth, and they said, fine, if you can get to 40,000 residents, we'll make you a state. We didn't have 40,000 residents. We were in the low 30,000s. And so our delegation kind of huddled and said, okay, this isn't good. What do we do? What do we do? And so they come up with an idea. They go back to Congress and they say, you guys seem busy. Why don't you let us do our own census for you? We'll take that off your hands. We'll do it a little early even. And we'll report back. We'll let you know how many people live in Illinois. So there's stories of them coming back, and they'd count like sheep and cattle, and they'd go in the farm fields in the daytime and count people, and then they'd come back to the houses at night and count the same people. My question is, and there's a lot of like reports of this from the time, why not just make the number up? Why are we counting pigs? But so anyone who complains about corruption in Illinois state government, this is just part of the deal here. It's a founding principle of ours. So we'll go a few decades forward. This is kind of the mid to late 1800s. We're almost at modern day travel tips, I promise you. And there's a lot happening in the labor situation globally. A gentleman named Karl Marx is writing some interesting pamphlets in Europe, but even in downstate southern Illinois, people are having kind of the same idea at that time. And it ushers in this chapter of Illinois history called the Coal Wars. Lots of coal in southern Illinois at the time, very important to these states' economy and the region's economy and energy supply. And there were no protections for these coal miners. They were working 7-day weeks. They were working all day. They were dying. At one of these events, somebody raised their hand, and an older woman said that their grandmother was from this area and that her graduating class in high school, not a single student had a living father because of how dangerous these mines were. So this was unfathomable. There were kids working in the mines. Frequently, they would just explode. I don't know how that works, but it would happen. And at some point, the miners said, why are we, it would be just as dangerous for us to fight back and fight our bosses as it would be to just follow the rules and go underground. So they did this, and there were these very bloody skirmishes all across southern Illinois. And the region still really cares about that chapter. The people who live there now, they know these family stories. They know relatives who died either working the mines or fighting the National Guard or the company goons. But really interesting chapter and somewhat sad but inspiring chapter of Southern Illinois history. If anybody knows Mother Jones, really influential labor leader from this era, she went all across the country organizing workers. But when she was getting old and she was deciding where she wanted to be buried, she said, of all the places I've been, all the workers I've fought alongside, I want to be buried with the miners in Southern Illinois. So you can go see, this is her grave in Mount Olive. And there's still, there's some statues of miners kind of watching over her grave, and people from all across the labor movement, all around the world, come and leave flowers and gifts there. But it all, and mining is still kind of important, or resource extraction. It's not a big part of the economy anymore, but you're in Southern Illinois when you're driving down the back roads and you see one of these oil pumps just in some regular front yard. There's you're just in a town and you see a pretty house and there's one of these things just going up and down in the front yard. Very interesting. But this coal war ushers in this chapter of Southern Illinois history, almost a century long, of tragedy and trauma. And the coal wars are just one part of that. So we'll go, just as kind of laws are being passed and workers are getting more protections, prohibition begins. And we think here in Chicagoland we have a monopoly on gangsters, but the situation was just as bloody and interesting down in Southern Illinois. This is the, and I'm blanking on the name, Charlie Berger's gang. There were a few gangs in Southern Illinois based around the city of Marion and Williamson County. And if you think about the geography, we were distributing illegal alcohol up in Chicago, and we were making it down in Tennessee and Kentucky. But how does it get from there to here? And the answer is these guys. They were controlling this really important piece of land, and they were determined to make their money doing it by any means necessary. And at the exact same time that they were kind of holding sway in Southern Illinois, the Ku Klux Klan was having a resurgence in the exact same area, kind of Indiana and southern and central Illinois. And the KKK was actually very much in favor of prohibition because they hated Catholics. So the KKK and these gangsters were at each other's throats. A lot of people caught in the middle, including law enforcement, who was completely overwhelmed by the situation. In some cases, you had local law enforcement kind of say, well, let's just let them kill each other and we don't have to do anything. But in most cases, one side or the other actually controlled law enforcement. So it was an incredibly, incredibly violent decade or two in southern Illinois. This would have been like front page news nationally. Williamson County was the murder capital of the country for several years. So really kind of devastating, right after the Cold Wars wrap up, we have bloody Williamson County kind of ravaged by this violence. And you think finally we're going to catch a break? Not quite. At the end of the 20s, early 30s, you have two phenomena happening across the country. The Dust Bowl we know happened in the Great Plains, but a lot of the same factors were happening in southern Illinois. Massive, massive soil loss. They had clear-cut all the trees, and then we had several dry years, and all that rich soil blew away or got washed into the Ohio or the Mississippi River. And multiple government sources at the time refer to southern Illinois, the Shawnee Forest area, as a wasteland. Massive poverty, huge unemployment, hunger, really, really bad social conditions. And I guess the good news is the Great Depression happened at the same time. And FDR set up this Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which was kind of partially a make-work program for unemployed young men, but also a huge conservation program. They came down to southern Illinois. They planted hundreds of thousands of trees and brought the ecology back to life, the economy back to life. Some people are kind of disappointed to learn this. They think Shawnee Forest is an old-growth forest. It's not. It's a second-growth forest. Although if you can stay awake for the duration of this presentation, I will show you some of the older trees that those pioneers missed. But it's really a breathtaking testament to the power of that kind of like collective action that a bunch of unemployed 20-year-olds could reinvent this beautiful forest that we can all go and enjoy today. So that's what we'll be doing for the rest of my talk. Something you should know about the Shawnee National Forest: it's not a national park, it's not a state park, there's not one entrance, there's not a little gatehouse with a friendly guy that gives you a map and waves you in. It's a national forest. It's really like a jurisdiction. There's towns inside of it, there's pockets of private property that you can't go on, but largely it's this patchwork of forests, lakes, rivers. There are state parks inside of it. We'll talk about them. There are these kind of strange, like federal recreation areas that you can go to. And there's parts of the forest that you can just pull your car up to the side of the road, walk in, and camp wherever you want. But they don't really have a name or a map or anything like that. So it's a really interesting place to explore. And it's also about 90 miles across. So you really want to be smart if you're heading down there. You don't want to have your morning spent up here and your afternoon spent down here. Then you're going to waste your whole day in the car. So we'll sometimes, spend a night or two over here, and then we'll pack up and we'll move and do another couple nights on the other side. You don't want to waste precious daylight driving across this. So this talk, we're going to spend most of the rest of the night just talking about the western region. It's kind of the most vibrant, the most things to do there, especially for newcomers. We'll spend just a few seconds in the central region. It's pretty small. There's some interesting places there. And then the eastern region, I really love it, but it's a little bit more remote. There's a little bit more winding about to get to the places you'll want to see. And the towns along the Ohio River, they're wonderful places. I highly recommend you explore them, but they're a little bit more economically distressed. You can't necessarily just get in the car when your gas tank is low and expect to find a gas station. You want to know where you're going to eat or brown bag your lunch or something, because you could really drive for a long time and not really see too much in terms of amenities, although there's plenty of natural beauty there. So, and you should have a handout if we ran out, or if you didn't get one, I'll send the link to the library, and we can get you that map. So most of the time we're going to be in the western part of the region for the rest of the night here. And Giant City, if you're a rookie, if you're a newcomer, this is a really, really, really great place to start. It's a state park, so there is like an entrance, there's campgrounds, there's trails, and it's really well mapped. There's a little interpretive museum. It's really well maintained. This is probably, if anywhere on your trip you're going to run into a crowd, it's probably here, but it's never that bad, unless you're there for like a once-in-a-lifetime eclipse, which I wouldn't recommend. Lots of accessible trails here, so if this is a multi-generational trip, if you have a disability or you're just not that sure on your feet, this is a really good place to begin and test the waters. Some of the trails elsewhere are quite rugged. So this is a really good place to just kind of dip your toe in. This park was made by the CCC in the 30s. We're still enjoying the fruits of their labor. There's a lot of tributes to them around the park. I like to include this particular guy because I see a lot of resemblance in terms of the physique there. I kind of see myself in him. And they also built this beautiful lodge in the 30s. You can go in there. You don't have to be staying on this premises to go and just put your feet up and rest a little bit. Fantastic, fantastic restaurant. This is my daughter actually like almost 2 years ago, believe it or not. But this is the first time she sat in a high chair. So really, really great fried chicken, really great brunch. But they're open for all meals, and there's nothing better than doing a little bit of hiking and then just pigging out. That'll be a common theme throughout this lecture. And I really recommend, as my favorite place to stay, the cabins that are surrounding the lodge. They give you that feel of being out in nature and having a rustic life, but most of them have bathrooms inside them, so you're never that uncomfortable. And you can get up in the morning and just walk to the lodge and eat a delicious breakfast. So if you're not necessarily a camper, this is a really great place to stay. Most of the cabins were built in like the 80s or more recently, but they do still have, I believe, a dozen of the original 1930s cabins that are great. Those ones, they share a bathroom kind of like in a different building. So that's the only bathroom-free option. But there's a lot of campsites too. Just a really great place to begin exploring the Shawnee Forest. My favorite kind of off the beaten trail site is Little Grand Canyon. It's just outside of Giant City, maybe 20 minutes away. It's not a state park. It's just a place on the map. I don't understand exactly the classification. I believe the federal government runs it. And word to the wise, if there are kind of shutdowns this year, if you're traveling this year, these places are still generally open, but if there's a problem with the trail, they might not be repaired. So you want to kind of look at the websites online if there's trouble with the U.S. Forest Service. And they also will stop cleaning the bathrooms too. But Little Grand Canyon, it's a 3-mile loop. Half of it is kind of in the bottom of this creek bed, very pretty, a little slippery, probably not great for like a kind of wishy-washy hiker, but you can hike on the other half, just out and back. It's a lot more even. You're going uphill, but it's a smooth walk, and you're rewarded with this beautiful view. This is a great place to watch the sunset. It faces west, but you do not want to bring your 1-year-old to watch the sunset, because then you'll be walking back with her in the dark, and it will be very stressful. So don't linger for those last rays to slip below the horizon. When you're done there, head up north to Murfreesboro. It's also in that same, we're kind of right around the Carbondale area, Giant City area. Murfreesboro is a really cute town, and 17th Street Barbecue is top of the list barbecue year after year after year. State of Illinois, but also nationally. This is the only restaurant that's won the National Barbecue Competition twice. So check it out. Really, really good food, sides, dessert, etc. But be careful when you're in Murfreesboro. It's plagued by the big muddy monster. This is, as far as I can tell, some local marketing person just took Bigfoot and gave him a new name. But it's a lot of fun. They have fun with him. There's murals, there's statues. There's even a beer named after him. So it's good. It's a good thing to keep an eye out for. The Big Muddy is the river down that goes through Shawnee Forest. Scratch Brewing. I'm not a drinker, so I didn't really know about this place. But I asked around, like, what are some hidden gems? What are some of your favorite places that are off the beaten trail? This was far and away the top recommendation for things that don't always make the list. And they actually do some foraging and use forest ingredients in their beer. A lot of beer drinkers look at me like, that sounds gross. I don't know. The beer tastes gross to me, so it sounds interesting. But sometimes they have food trucks or wood-fired pizza, but they don't always have food, so look out. And the interior is really stunning, too. It's just a beautiful place to sit and relax. And Carbondale, college town. It's got a lot of pros, a few cons. It is a little run down. There's some cheap places sometimes. I like that, but don't expect like this picturesque little hamlet. It's a college town. But the campus itself is gorgeous. There's a lot of good dining options. You'll notice most of the restaurants I talk about kind of meat-oriented. So if you're a vegetarian, if you're gluten-free, this is a good place to kind of come eat some meals. Quattro's Pizza is like kind of on a lot of people's lists. It's very good, but like we're from Chicago, we got pizza up here. I say go there if you want pizza, but otherwise go somewhere else first. And this is just kind of a summary slide. A few things I didn't get to, but you can ask me about later if you're interested. Okay, so at this point, if anyone needs to get up and leave the room, this is my trigger warning. We're going to be talking about snakes. You'll notice I won't be turning around and looking at my own screen here. So, Snake Road is the only road in the country that is closed by the federal government to vehicle traffic due to excessive snake migration. So if you go here in the spring or fall during the 6 weeks that they close the road, you will guaranteed see hundreds of snakes slither by. So to some people, maybe it's a time to not go to Snake Road, but to some real weirdos out there, I know you're out there, you'll want to like mark your calendar and go then. You are allowed to walk down the road. You're encouraged to. Just don't touch the snakes. Good news and bad news. There's only 4 types of venomous snakes in the state of Illinois. That's the good news. The bad news is they all live in Shawnee National Forest. So memorize these stripes. And I'm mostly joking around. I'm a big wimp. I've spent days, probably weeks cumulatively in southern Illinois, and I've never had a run-in with a snake. I've seen a few of them, probably not these guys, like getting out of my way on the trail, but they won't bother you if you don't bother them. The issue with the venomous snakes is if you're really doing like primitive camping and you're just walking into the woods with your backpack for days, you could stumble upon a den of poisonous snakes. So hopefully if you're doing that, you know what you're doing. So if you are bitten by a snake, I pulled this helpful information from the State Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Forest Service. So do not try to catch it or fight back. Just don't. That would not be my reaction, but apparently it needs to be said. If you're the type of person that wants to have revenge on a snake, you're probably not going to listen to me. That's just what you're going to do. Call for medical help. Make noise. Stop the bleeding. Do not. This is another one. This is another head scratcher, but it's on both websites. Don't suck out the venom. I'm not sure why. If you've got venom in your ankle, you would also want to put it in your mouth, but don't do that. And then as you're sitting down waiting to be rescued or, just trying to catch your breath, you're probably going to be fine. No one's actually died in southern Illinois in 200 years, but it's a good time to think about your legacy and make a small or large donation to the Gail Borden Foundation. You're going to come back home. You're going to be fine. but maybe they'll have a parade for you when you show up. So just don't want to leave this business unattended to. Yes, thank you, thank you. So Snake Road is right by the snake warning is over, by the way. The Snake Road is right at the foot of the LaRue Pine Hills. It's just another place to put on your map. Really beautiful, kind of unique even for the Shawnee Forest. A different mix of plants and rocks there. And at the top is Inspiration Point, another kind of top-rated vista. You can drive basically to this view. I think it's less than a half a mile to walk from your parking lot to Inspiration Point. But you can also spend some time hiking. There's some very rugged trails there as well. So we've done a lot of hiking. Let's talk about relaxing for a minute. There's something called the Shawnee Country Wine Trail. There's more than a dozen wineries and vineyards in southern Illinois. They're really making the push. I've heard, again, I'm not a drinker, I'm not the best source here, but I've heard really good things about it, and then I've also heard it's like fruity, which I guess perhaps some people think is gross. But they're very pretty places. Some of them have food on the weekends. It's just a really good place to relax. There's also orchards if you're there in season. This is all kind of just south of Giant City in that western section of the forest. So when I talked about the west versus the east, there's just more of this kind of commercial development in the western section. It doesn't detract from the nature, but there's just a little bit more to do if you're just a casual traveler. And people ask me about Cairo, spelled Cairo. It's on a lot of lists as like a ghost town or a like abandoned city to go explore. I really like it. There's some kind of problematic aspects to like driving through a really struggling town and like gawking at abandoned houses. So the people who live in Cairo still, and there are many of them, kind of resent this kind of tourism coming down south of the forest just to look at them. But there's some great places if you do go to get out of your car, to chat with people. The Shummel's barbecue is like your classic southern like barbecue shack. They give you your food on a paper plate. It's really cheap, but it's delicious. This is a good place to stop. And there's a Fort Defiance State Park. There's not much there. It's just kind of a quiet space, but it's right at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio. So it's a cool place to check out. The town is like a good half hour south of the forest, so it's not exactly on your way. So we'll kind of wrap up the western half now. A few things I didn't talk about. I always say this name wrong, Cape Girardeau. Does anybody know? I'm getting nods. Okay. I just panic when I see that many vowels in a row. I brought my pronunciation guide, but it's kind of awkward when I'm looking through it in front of everyone. This is a college town, just like Carbondale. It's just across the river. I hate to tell anyone to leave the state, but there's a lot of like more diversity in restaurants and some lodging opportunities there as well. And this Bald Knob Peace Cross, this is the highest point in the Shawnee Forest. There's this giant illuminated cross up at the top, but there's also like a parking lot. If you're not a hiker and you want to just have the experience of being above the canopy, that's a good spot to have on your radar. But there's not a lot to it. So really briefly, the central region, Fern Cliff is a state park. This is probably the easiest to access waterfall. There's over 20 waterfalls in the forest. But Fern Cliff has a really nice one that's not hard to like hike to. But all of the waterfalls in the forest are very temporary, seasonal. You can't count on seeing a good steady waterfall. It's not Niagara. I like to think that the waterfalls are kind of a consolation prize. If you're down there and it's a crummy, rainy weekend or something, it's very pretty to come see that in action. And honestly, all the bluffs all around you kind of are glistening and trickling with water after it rains for a while. Just keep your footwear, appropriate for lots of mud. And Fern Cliff does not have a restaurant and a lodge. They've got great campsites They've got bathrooms. It's a little bit more manicured, a little bit more welcoming. There's a map and everything like that. So it has the benefits of a state park. There's a 45-mile bike trail, Tunnel Hill Trail. If you're a big cyclist, it's good to have on your map. I kind of am spoiling the best part of it, but that's that. If you're not a bike rider, you can always drive to Tunnel Hill and just go for a little stroll through this tunnel. There's a little ice cream shop at the other end there. So I promised you old trees. This is where to find your old trees. Cache River, Cypress Creek. Technically, it's just south of the official forest zone, but it's very close by in that central region. The best way to go exploring it is to go to, there's 2 river outfitters there. They're both really well reviewed, and you can go paddle in here. Really recommend a guided tour. I kind of think if I was alone looking at this, I would never be seen again. But it's not particularly dangerous. There's no gators. The water's not very deep. It's just a pretty kind of surreal experience. And some of the oldest trees in the state are there. Dixon Springs is another state park. I love every single inch of Shawnee National Forest. I'm not disparaging it. But if you're short on time, this is a park I say that you can skip. It's just a little bit like worse for wear. It needs some updates in terms of the campsites. Not a ton of hiking. There's like a pool there that's been closed for many years. So it's interesting. If you're spending a week down there, it's worth checking out. It's like an old Victorian mineral spa site. There's a lot of interesting history there. It's just not quite as robust as the other state parks we've talked about. This is Ghost Dance Canyon Trail. This is the trail I recommend there. If it's appealing to you, as it was to me, to kind of climb over all these rocks, it's just like a couple miles of this. It's pretty interesting. Though you don't want to be thinking about those snakes while you're like sticking your foot into those cracks. And then finally, the East region. As I said, it's a little more remote, but also a little more kind of breathtaking. Garden of the Gods. This is like the #1 photographed spot in Shawnee National Forest. I used to start the presentation with this, and I love it, and I recommend you go there. But I do tell people there's not a whole lot to it. The trail itself is about half a mile. It's very, very even, very accessible. Lots of interpretive signage, and of course, this amazing view for most of the trail. So it's worth 100% worth going to. It's just not it's not like a full-on state park or anything like that. There are trails that go off of it into the wilderness. They're quite interesting, but again, this talk is geared at people who've never been down here before, maybe aren't always going on hiking adventures. So it's 100% worth stopping at, but it's probably not like the most bang for your buck in terms of you don't want to spend a whole day here. Really pretty though. My wife's favorite spot, I think, she's in the back there, yes, is Rim Rocks and Pounds Hollow. There are 2 more sites. They're right next to each other and only less than 10 minutes from Garden of the Gods. So I say, like, go to Garden of the Gods, take it all in, be amazed, and then drive down here to go for your hike. Rim Rocks, you kind of descend these endless steps to get down into the ravine. If that's not for you, you can park at Pounds Hollow, which is at ground level, and just walk. I think I have a picture, kind of along the base of these bluffs. So either way you want to do it, it's really interesting, really breathtaking. And my favorite spot in the eastern region is Bellsmith Springs. I'm getting a nod. You approve? Yes. Oh, good, good. It's a little bit like daunting, not in the sense that it's dangerous or anything, but you really are like winding up with all these like switchbacks and gravel roads, and you question, am I in the right place? Not a lot of, I think there's some porta potties there, but even the sign that has the map posted, it's like so worn away by people touching it that you can't quite even tell where you are. So in that sense, it's kind of a good place to go get lost. You know, it's contained. You're not going to disappear forever. But it's just kind of this, it's just like this network of trails you can kind of wander. and you really get to see like diversity of views. This is my favorite spot. It starts out, there's this exposed rock that you can walk along top of. There's even people that go there and like sunbathe as the sun warms up the rocks. But here you can kind of step over this little crack that has a little bit of water in it. And then by the other end of this section of trail, that ravine is huge. There's trees that are growing in it that like don't even reach the top of it. So it's really interesting geology. Like I said, just the diversity. You can really kind of see everything Shawnee has to offer here. And it's quiet and off the beaten trail. So a few other things to talk about here. I am somehow on schedule today. This is good. It's a rarity for me. A lot of waterfalls in this area. Again, they're temporary. Cave and rock. Everybody asks me about cave and rock. It's cool. It's neat. But if you want to just look at my picture here that I took from the back, it's kind of the gist of it. It's not like mammoth caves. It's not like a system of caverns and tunnels. It's cool. It's a big hole in the rock. If you're in that area, 100% recommend you check it out. Do I say you should drive like 45 minutes from Giant City State Park just to see it? I'm not sure. But there's a lot of interesting legend and lore. River pirates would hide their booty there. The Prohibition, smugglers would use the cave. So it's an interesting place. Actually, my favorite part of it was kind of a rainy day when we were there, and we just sat at the top of this hill and watched this ferry. There's like an Ohio River ferry that would drive your car across the river into Kentucky. For some reason, that's interesting to me. So I was talking about that at another program, and some guy raised his hand and tells me in this great detail, he kind of took over the rest of the presentation about like you turn this, take the ferry, make a right, go left about 3 miles, make another right, and then you get to this like defective candy outlet store where you can get a pallet of Milk Duds for $17. And so next time we're down here, my plan, because it's always so awkward to ride the ferry across and then be like, okay, I'm ready to go back now. So I'm going to go on a candy run next time. So the boxes are dented or something, so you get them really cheap. And then one much more cruel and tragic tale to kind of fit with the theme of the history of the region from earlier, I'll talk about here is the salt works. Saline County is one of the counties in the eastern part of the forest, so named for the salt deposits underground here. And at the time of settlement, there were no trains. Even river shipping was very difficult and treacherous. And salt was so extremely important, not just as a seasoning, but to preserve your food. So for the entire kind of interior of the continent, it was really difficult to obtain salt. And one way they did it, another scientific process I can explain to you, is they would just kind of boil this muck in the ground in these giant kilns and separate the salt from the water and the mud. At the time of statehood, 1/3 of the state's revenue came from the salt works here. And I share this because the salt was so important that our supposedly anti-slavery state, an anti-slavery constitution, actually made an exception if the slaves were working the salt mines. It was the government would turn the other way and let it happen. So some really kind of sad stories around that. This man Crenshaw, they actually just closed this house down. It was kind of a rinky-dink museum. They kind of distorted the history quite a bit. But Crenshaw himself was a real man, and he would actually capture free African-American Illinoisans and sell them into slavery. So really, really dark blot on Illinois history and on the region. That history is there in the forest. Fort Massac is it's great if you're an Illinois history nerd. A lot of reenactments there. It's this fort that dates back to Native American times. It was a French fort, then it was a British fort, then it was an American fort. People like Zebulon Pike of Pikes Peak stopped there. Andrew Jackson, before he was president, was there. And a gentleman by the name of Aaron Burr. I don't know if there's any Hamilton fans out there. I don't want to spoil the end of that musical, but after he did that really bad thing to Hamilton, he headed out west, and he ended up here in southern Illinois at this fort. And I guess he hatched this plot to like secede from the United States. He wanted like Louisiana and Texas and Arkansas to kind of be their own country. Not quite clear on the details. It never happened. But it's an interesting place to walk around. It was closed. A lot of the state historic sites are closed or reopened recently, and it's actually a good thing. There's a ton of investment put in a few years ago, so a lot of restoration work going on. So if you're going to stop there, make sure they're open. Lots of cool Ohio River towns. Golconda, there's a great chocolate shop there. Cool kind of levee that you can walk above the Ohio River. Really interesting place. Elizabethtown, there's a restaurant on a boat. You can eat freshly caught fish. A lot of rave reviews for that. Metropolis, fancies itself the hometown of Superman. They have a Superman festival every year. Right across the river from Metropolis is Paducah, Kentucky. Again, I'm loath to ever suggest anyone leave the great state of Illinois, but it is a nice town. They're often on the top, like, best main streets in the country. And again, especially if you have dietary needs or you want a little bit more amenities for your lodging, there's a lot of commercial activity in Paducah. There's also like the National Quilt Museum if you're a quilter. It's an interesting place. So we'll just wrap things up. Okay, great. With a few notes. GPS, it works. And you generally, if you're on the road, you're going to have a cell phone signal now. It wasn't always that way. You lose your signal when you're really like in a ravine hiking. But GPS when you're driving will work pretty well. The note of caution is trust but verify. It might tell you you can save 1 minute by taking a route that looks like this. And it never saves you a minute in my experience. So stick to the kind of straight-looking highways when that's an option. When you're ultimately getting to your trailhead or your park, you're going to have to kind of venture into some shakier ground. But in terms of getting from point A to point B, stay on the county roads if you can. This is one thing that happened when we didn't take that advice. This dog just walked up to our car and wouldn't move, and I was afraid of running over his paws, and we lost like 40 minutes just like saying like, shoo, shoo. My wife ended up taking bites out of an apple and like tossing them out the window to distract him. So another one, I was in my mom's minivan. Actually, that time we had just a mattress in the back of the van, and we would just pull over and camp in the car. But I was in my mom's car, kind of a clunker, and we just get to a creek with no bridge, and we're just expected to drive over it. But instead, I made a 140-point turn and went back the way I came. Like I said earlier, don't always. It's not like you're in the Sahara Desert or anything. There's people around. They have what you need down there. But don't just count on encountering a gas station at the right time. Always make sure you got a decently full tank and kind of know where you're going to eat. Not only are there stretches without much restaurants or grocery stores, but also hours are kind of funny, like places close earlier than you might think. So just have a plan. On that note, especially if you're going to see the sunset, have a flashlight, have a plan to get back. I don't think coyotes attack people generally, but if you're walking around at night, you will hear packs of coyotes howling in the distance, and it will freak you out. Also, lots of owls, too. And then my only note on lodging is there's some really cool Airbnbs and other like rentals. You can sleep in a treehouse, you can sleep on a boat, etc., etc. And those are cool if that's what you want. But generally, those really kind of interesting remote places take a while to get to. They're kind of off the main road. So if your plan is to cram as much of this into a long weekend as possible, I say kind of avoid that. And I'll even stay in like a like interstate side hotel if it means that I can just get on the road first thing in the morning and get out there. But I do love Giant City, those cabins too, and also camping. This is a very uninteresting slide, but basically, if you're on limited time, I hate to tell people to stay on the interstates. There's so much happening over here. I have many other programs I can be hired to give on this part of the state. But if you're on limited time, just get on 57 and get down there as fast as you can. If you are retired, maybe you're a billionaire looking to hire a travel guide, and you have a lot of time, you can take kind of 51 through the land of Lincoln, through Springfield, through Bloomington. There's a lot of nice places to get out and stop, but it adds a lot of time to your trip. Only 90 minutes, maybe 60 minutes of driving, but if you're doing that drive, you're going to want to get out of your car and see stuff, and it ends up adding hours and hours. Same thing with the Great River Road. A few people ask me, they get this idea that they're going to drive down the Mississippi to southern Illinois. Sounds wonderful if you have like 2 weeks. But the thing about the Great River Road is there's a zillion places to stop and things to do and see there too. So I say like plan 2 trips or else just quit your job and just drive out into the sunset. That's what I would like to do if anyone is offering to make that possible for me. So a few books to recommend. We were listening to regional music. That code, I think, is also on your map. This WPA guide, this is from the time they were making the Shawnee National Forest. It's a guidebook. Some famous Illinois authors kind of got their start writing for the federal government, writing this guidebook. And it's available in the library system. It's free online. I bought my copy. Bucky Fuller, he invented the geodesic dome. Really interesting, kind of eccentric professor from SIU. And this book got a lot of praise. It's a really interesting book about him. So I believe that's it. Thanks so much. I have a newsletter. I'm on social media. I'd love to hear from you. And now I like to say at this point, it's no longer rude to leave the room, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. So thanks for bearing with me. Any questions?